So good afternoon. We'll officially start today with our Purdue Extension Hot Topics. Today with the topic forest management, prescribed burns. There should be a demographic poll up on your window. We'd love you to have that. Get that going while we get started. Matthias, I'll have you do your thing. As always, if you do have questions or comments, if you could throw those into the chat box, we do have a good crowd today. And then we will answer those or get those answered throughout the program. Please keep your mics muted because we do record this for folks to have in the future. So, Matthias, I'll let you get to your thing.
All right, so today we are privileged to have Jared Brooke joining us. Jared Brooke hailed from or grew up in Albany, Indiana, and was raised outdoors, including hunting and fishing. Um, his passion for the outdoors was instilled in him by his family and his time hunting behind the bird dog, and which led him to attend Purdue University to study wildlife science. So he graduated from Purdue in 2012 and then attended the University of Tennessee, pursuing a master's degree in wildlife management. So after graduating from the University of Tennessee, he worked with the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources and the National Resource Conservation Service as a farm bill wildlife biologist in Western Kentucky. He started as an extension specialist at Purdue in August of 2016. And once again, it's Jared Brooke, and he's our wildlife extension specialist. So, Jared, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Matthias, and thanks for the introduction. I'm going to go ahead and get things shared here, and we'll get going. Okay. All right. So what I kind of want to do today is kind of just talk about prescribed fire broadly in Indiana, kind of what is it, who uses it, why they use it, and kind of end on a little bit of how you might implement a prescribed fire. And the goal of this talk is really just to give you an introduction and like very basics of prescribed fire. It's not meant to allow you to have all the knowledge you need to go out and use prescribed fire on your own landscapes and your own properties. So we're not going to cover a lot of the how, but more of the why and what is it, to give you just a little bit of a brief introduction to the concept of wildfire, or sorry, the concept of prescribed fire. So I'm sure all of you are familiar with this character here. His name's up there. Smokey the Bear has been around since the 1940s as kind of a mascot of the U.S. Forest Service, and as a kind of a PSA, started out as a PSA to help prevent fires from occurring in a lot of our Forest Service lands and national parks and things like that. So, you know, he has his catchphrase, "Only you." And then folks in the chat, can you finish that catchphrase? So it's "Only you can." And then there's two more words after that. Anyone know what those words are? See how familiar you are with Smokey. So you can type the rest of that phrase there in the chat. And for some reason, I can't see the chat. Oh, there we go. All right. Okay. So most of you, all right. So most of you are all correct until 2001. So initially, Smokey's catchphrase was "Only you can prevent forest fires." And that really reflected our attitude as a population towards fire up until 2001. And the change, and Veronica got it, the change that happened in 2001 was his catchphrase changed from "Only you can prevent forest fires" to "Only you can prevent wildfires." And maybe it's a little bit of nuance, and maybe you're not thinking there's much of a difference there, but the big change was to kind of reflect our understanding and change of fire as a tool for land management and as a tool to kind of help ecosystems. And so his saying changed from forest fires to wildfires in order to acknowledge that fire itself isn't necessarily inherently bad. It can actually be a tool we use to restore ecosystems. And many ecosystems across the United States actually thrive with fire as a stewardship practice. But we don't want those wildfires that could, be these mega wildfires you see out in California and in the Western U.S., like that picture there in front of you. And we don't want those wildfires to occur in areas that could threaten human lives or threaten other things that we're interested in that we care about. And so it kind of this shift in that single word of wildfire or of forest fires or wildfires really reflect this idea of that, you know, we can use fire as a way to maintain and enhance and restore ecosystems across the United States. And so on that picture on the left there, this is from a Forest Land Stewardship magazine. And you can see that Smokey the Bear now has a drip torch in his hand. And he's promoting the use of what we call prescribed burning or prescribed fire. And that video there on the right is an example of what a prescribed fire would look like in Indiana in one of our forests. So that's a prescribed fire we did up around West Lafayette, Indiana. And this is this concept of what's called good fire, and this idea that there is value to having fire in a lot of different ecosystems. These ecosystems developed with fire, many of them did, and we'll talk about some of those specific ones in Indiana here in a minute. But this idea that we can use fire as a restorer, not just a destroyer, right? So we can restore ecosystems with fire, and we can actually use fire in a very controlled way to prevent some of those catastrophic mega wildfires that you're seeing out west. And that's that concept of good fire. And so the image is in front of you. On the left there, you see that's a white oak seedling that resprouted following a prescribed fire in a southern Indiana woodland. And then a picture on the right there is a monarch butterfly on top of a purple coneflower that came up after we burned a prairie restoration over near Muncie, Indiana. And so when we think about this concept of good fire, or how do we apply fire in a way that's beneficial to plants, animals, in these ecosystems, then we get to this idea of prescribed fire. So prescribed fire is really fire that's applied within a predetermined environmental conditions with specific management goal. So we're using fire as a tool to manage ecosystems and to promote certain plants and certain wildlife species. And those are our specific management goals. But we're also doing it under predetermined environmental conditions to where A, we know that we can actually get the fire to go, we can get things to actually burn, but B, we're doing it in a controlled manner where we're using the weather and things to our advantage under specific environmental conditions to know that we can control that fire and stop it from burning areas that we don't want to burn. So that's that idea of prescribed fire, in that we're being intentional with our burning to make sure that it's safe, but also to make sure that it's going to restore and promote these ecosystems that we're interested in. So now that we have kind of a common definition of what prescribed fire is, I kind of want to step us back in time a little bit and think about what is the history of fire in Indiana. And I think this is an important thing to kind of consider, to think about how was fire historically used across ecosystems in Indiana to help that shape how we might think about how we can use fire currently and in the future to manage the diverse ecosystems across Indiana. And so I think there's this kind of common thing I hear, and common maybe myth that I hear about fire's relationship to Indiana's ecosystems. And the common thing I hear and the common myth I hear is that, you know, fire didn't really play an important role in Indiana historically because we have wetter forests, more mesic forests, or more mesic vegetation, and that fire and prescribed fire is really more of a Western thing. That those, you know, fires occur out west, but they're not really an Eastern thing because we have too wet an environment to promote fire. But I think that really downplays the role that fire had in shaping our ecosystems, and the role that the humans that were here for thousands of years had in shaping our landscape, and in a very purposeful way. And we can look at kind of Indiana's fire history, and we can look at lines of evidence to kind of tell us how fire was used historically. And one of those lines of evidence is kind of oral traditions and oral histories of Native American populations, as well as early settler accounts of Native Americans using fire, and then even things like looking at cutting trees down and looking at fire scars to see when fires would have occurred on a landscape. And some lines of evidence that we kind of use to shape our understanding of what Indiana's history of fire was, again, relates to those native communities that were managing the landscape intentionally to provide them the resources they needed to make a living for thousands of years prior to European settlement. And there's a couple quotes that I like to kind of talk about that came from an article called The Coming Out Place, which is kind of a article about the origin stories of the Miami tribe of Native Americans that call this place home for thousands of years. And so there's a few really good quotes about the intentional use of fire by these Native communities, and that this was the single most important tool that they had to manage their environment, and that those intentional human ignited fires altered the biodiversity of the landscape and created an abundance of resources for those first people. And so this is like one thread and line of evidence that we can pull to think about, well, how important was fire and how was it used across the landscape prior to European settlement? To kind of take that one step further, if we think about the actual oral history of some of these tribes, we can look at the Miami Nation as one of those tribes. And the image there on the right kind of shows the historical distribution of the Miami tribe, which covers all of Indiana into Illinois, Wisconsin, part of Michigan, and into Ohio. And if we look at their lunar calendar specifically, they had 2 lunar calendar months that were focused on this idea of cultural burning. And that was burning that was important to their culture, but also important in helping them create the resources they needed to thrive on the landscape. And those months were the grass burning moon, which is roughly September and October, and then the smoky burning moon, which is roughly October and November. And kind of what this tells me is that fire was an integral part, and these intentional fires across these ecosystems was an important enough component of the culture and the practices of this tribe and this nation that they dedicated 2 lunar months of the year to this practice. And you can kind of see some reasoning for why they would be burning these types of year. And if we kind of zoom out a little bit and think about fire more broadly in different Native American tribes, we can think about why was fire used in the past intentionally to kind of shape these landscape. Well, there's lots of lines of evidence to suggest that Native Americans were keenly aware of the fact that when they burned these landscapes, it created vegetation, grasses and wildflowers and food resources that would attract the animals that they were interested in hunting. Things like bison and things like elk here in Indiana that we would have historically had. So it would attract those species to make them easier to harvest. There's also evidence that they would use fire to clear the understory of dense forests to help with travel, to help with regeneration of certain plant species. They would use fire as a way to clear land for agriculture. They use fire as a way to kind of enhance and promote the production of acorns and hickory nuts, but also soft mass species like blackberries and different things like that. If you go up to the northeast part of the state, northeast part of the United States, Native American tribes were using fire in blueberry fields for thousands of years in order to kind of promote blueberry production. It also aided them in hunting, so they could use fire as a way to kind of drive game into certain places to be able to easy to harvest. And kind of what this created was these diverse ecosystems that allowed wildlife and plants to thrive. And if we kind of fast forward to today, to how we can think about how we might use fire as an ecosystem restoration tool and what benefits it might have to our ecosystems and landscape today, there's really some benefits that we can think about from fire. And that's things like ecosystem restoration, health and resilience, restoring wildlife habitat, and then lastly, that idea of fuels management. So kind of reducing the severity of some of potential wildfires. And we do have wildfires here in Indiana. They're just on smaller scales than out west because of our landscape. And so we can really think about fire today as a restorer, so how to restore these ecosystems. And you may be thinking to yourself, well, what ecosystems in Indiana had fire in them historically, and how are they kind of fire shaped? And what I mean by fire shaped is that the practice of fire, especially here in Indiana, human intentionally set fires, how did that kind of shape the plant community and animal community that we had? And some of the most common ones that we see across the landscape, or we would have had historically across the landscape, would be things like tall grass prairies, oak, forest, woodlands, and savannas, glades, barrens, and dunes. Glades and barrens are typically areas that have pretty shallow, rocky, or sandy soil. A lot of them occur in the southern part of Indiana, but you actually get glades and barrens up around the northwest part of the state as well. And then dunes are up around the lakeshore. And then actually some wetland areas that might have actually burned, things like flatwoods, fens, and meadows. And so flatwoods are found throughout the state. There's some pretty good examples of flatwoods down in kind of the Posey and Warwick County area. There's some here around West Lafayette where I am, some down in the southeast part of the state, but they're essentially these wooded areas that have pretty wet soils throughout the most time of year, but then in the late summer, early fall, they get pretty dry and actually can burn pretty easily. So I'm going to kind of focus on a couple of these ecosystems that people might be most familiar with: the tall grass prairie, and then oak, forest, woodlands, and savannas. So I think another line of evidence that we can use to kind of understand what the historical context of fire are, what the historical concept of fire in Indiana is, to think about how are plants adapted to fire. And so now I'm going to kind of get really nerdy here and think about kind of what plant traits relate to how plants respond to fire and adapt to kind of what happens after a fire. And there's a whole list of them. And some of these are specifically related to fire, meaning that they couldn't really be related to any other driving force because they're so kind of focused on fire. Other types of adaptations like resprouting may be related to fire, but they could also be related to responses to things like grazing. And so the list there's one that's called serotiny, and this is a really cool adaptation that many pine species have, in that these pine species, their cones need to be heated to a certain temperature in order for those cones to open and actually release their seeds. So if those cones are never heated to a certain temperature, they never release their seed. And you can say that there's a one-to-one relationship between serotiny and fire, right? And so these species adapted in fire-prone environments, and that's their adaptation, is that they will only release their seeds when they're heated to a certain temperature. The same thing with smoke and heat-induced germination. There's actually compounds found in the smoke that cause physiological changes in the seeds, in that they will actually start germination after being exposed to those chemical compounds in the smoke. Some of these other ones that we'll talk about here in a second can be related to both things like drought or being browsed by deer or other species. To kind of give you an example of what that would look like, this picture in the top left corner here is the Indiana Dunes National Park. And if you've ever been on what they call their Succession Trail, this is the trail that leads you out to Lake Michigan. And a lot of these pines that we have here in the background are actually what's called jack pine. And jack pine is one of those species that has serotinous cones, which means that their cones, again, will not open and release their seeds unless they're heated to a certain temperature. And in order to have jack pines and have young jack pines and really jack pine ecosystems, they have to be burned. And so you actually get a lot of burning that occurs along the national lakeshore or in the national park. And this is actually one of the areas of the state where you'll see wildfires. These ecosystems are more common in some of the lake states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, but you get them right around the lakeshore. Related to flammability, if you look at this pile of leaf litter here, a lot of different leaves in there, but mainly oak species. And so this is white oak here, chestnut oak from southern Indiana. And these oak leaves actually curl more than things like maple and beech leaves. And what that does is that actually makes them more flammable than beech and maple leaves. And so if you ever walk through a forest that has a lot of oak litter, it tends to be louder and crunchier than a beech forest. And those leaves are actually easier to burn and promote fire. Another kind of characteristic or adaptation of fire is the ability to resprout, but also the ability to have really long root systems. And so oaks resprout pretty easily after fire. This is probably only a 1 or 2 year old, probably a 2-year-old oak seedling, and it resprouted easily after being burned by fire. Also related to flammability and large root systems, this is little blue stem here. And in the winter, when this vegetation dries down, it is very flammable and promotes fire really well, but also has a very large root system in order to be able to resprout following a fire. This white oak here that we burned across has very thick bark, and that thick bark protects the oak from being damaged by the fire. Common milkweed, that's a nice monarch butterfly caterpillar on a common milkweed. Common milkweed is one of those species that has been shown to have enhanced germination following a fire because of the compounds that are in the smoke of the fire. So now that we have kind of an understanding of some of the ecosystems that responded, that are kind of fire adapted, and how some of those plants are fire adapted, I kind of wanted to kind of talk more in depth about 2 of these ecosystems, tallgrass prairie and then oak ecosystems, and how the role that fire plays in these ecosystems. So when we think about tallgrass prairies, prairie plants are probably some of the most fire adapted plants that we have in the United States and here in Indiana. Some of those adaptations that they have are things like flammability. So if you look at a prairie in the winter, most of the vegetation is going to be completely dormant, and you're going to have kind of brown dead vegetation on the surface that enhances their ability to be burned. And so that the material is pretty flammable. I'm sure folks have seen this image on the right here. They have extensive root systems that can go 12 to 15 feet down into the soil, which allows them to store a lot of nutrients and resources in those root systems so that they're able to resprout following a disturbance like fire. Another important thing is that a lot of times in the winter, the actual growth point of these prairie plants is underground. And so that when you burn all the leaf litter and all the litter, dead material off the top of the soil surface, the growth point is underground and it's not exposed to heat, and it's not stressed by that heat. So it's easier they germinate readily and aren't affected by the fire. Their growth is actually enhanced by the fire. And then, like I said before, some of those species have that smoke and heat induced germination. Things like common milkweed, even things like Cytodes grama, which is a grass, and wild indigo have all been shown to have smoke or heat induced germination. So some of the benefits that fire plays in shaping these ecosystems are things like reducing woody plants, so helping to control woody plants. The fire actually adds nutrients to the soil, so the nutrients that are kind of tied up in that dead plant material. As you remove that dead plant material with fire, a certain amount of phosphorus and nitrogen and potassium and things like that are added back into the soil. Having that kind of black soil surface after prescribed fire actually helps warm the soil and leads to earlier germination of some of these plant species. And again, that smoke and fire can actually cue germination. From a wildlife and cattle standpoint, fire actually makes these species more palatable because it removes that dead vegetation and you have nice green regrowing vegetation after the fire. And that was pretty historically important because Native Americans would use fire as a way to make the grasses more palatable to bison in order to kind of shape the landscape of where bison were using. And then fire promotes plant diversity, and we'll show some examples of here that pretty soon. And so how frequent was fire in these tallgrass prairies? It was very frequent fires historically, anywhere from 1 to 5 years. Once you kind of move beyond that kind of 5-year time frame, then a lot of woody plants take over. And historically, as Native Americans were burning the landscape, you would have had this interaction between fire and bison grazing that would have shaped the plant communities, but also shaped where the bison were using across the landscape. And so here's an example of a tallgrass prairie restoration where we did a prescribed fire. This was burned in September, and you can kind of see that black soil surface that's going to allow for the earlier warming of the soil surface for better germination. And so this is actually a conservation reserve program field in West Lafayette, Indiana. So we burned this section here and then did not burn these other sections. And we can kind of change when we burn to kind of shape the plant community and shape what the plant community structure and composition looks like. To kind of provide you an example of this, these are pictures from that same exact property. And so the picture over here on the left kind of shows you what the plant composition and structure looks like when you don't burn. This picture in the middle kind of shows you what it looks like if you burn in the spring. And this picture on the right here kind of shows you what the plant community looks like when you burn in the fall. So lots of grass, lots of dead vegetation in the area we didn't burn. We start to have a little bit more plant diversity in the March burn. You can kind of see some bare ground there as well. And then in September, all these pictures were taken in July after the burn. So in July of 2023. And so the area we burned in September, you can kind of see a completely different kind of look and structure to that vegetation and pretty high plant diversity in there, largely as a result of that fire. And so things like false sunflower, bergamot, we had this one here is prairie clover. So lots of different plants and wildflowers in there. This is another example of tallgrass prairie restoration in Indiana. This is actually at Kankakee Sands, which is owned by the Nature Conservancy near Morocco, Indiana. So they've done, almost 10,000 acres of prairie restoration in this area. And then recently they've actually added these critters back into it. So this picture is actually taken from the bison viewing area. And so they've added bison back into some of these prairies as a way to help manage them. So kind of returning that fire and grazing relationship back to the landscape. So that's a little bit about how fire and prairies are related. Now we're going to kind of talk about fire and oak ecosystems. So again, oaks are adapted to fire as well, and hickories. They have thick bark that shields them from the heat of the fire, and they're also able to what's called compartmentalize wounds, which means that if you have a fire that's hot enough where you actually get a wound or an injury to the base of an oak tree, they're able to kind of grow around that wound and kind of close that wound off from fungus and rot and things like that. The benefit of that is that allows them to kind of not succumb to the wound and continue to grow. Species like beech and tulip poplar, they're not able to do that. And so if you wound a beech or a tulip poplar with fire, that wound will never close and they'll eventually kind of start to rot from the inside out. They also have what's called hypogeal growth. Again, I'm going to nerd out here for a minute. And that essentially what that means is that they put most of their energy into growing roots first rather than shoots, which allows them to grow large root systems and able to sprout and resprout after a fire. And again, their leaves promote fire. So some of the benefits that fire has in oak ecosystems is that it promotes oak and hickory regeneration, so young seedlings and saplings of oaks, and it promotes plant diversity. So this is my colleague Brian McGowan. He's standing next to a white oak sapling that's probably 3 years old and resprouted following a fire that was in this woodland. And so these things can grow rapidly following a fire because of that large root system and ability to resprout. Benefits of fire also that it reduces woody competition. And so things that oaks would compete with would be things like tulip poplar, which grow extremely fast and may shade out young oak trees. But those species succumb to fire more easily than oaks do. And it changes the plant structure, which we'll talk about here in a minute. So really fire every 2 to 15 years inside of an oak forest really helps restore those ecosystems. To kind of show you a really good example of how fire can be added back into an oak system. This is from a picture from Tennessee on a property that I used to work on when I worked and lived down there, called Catoosa Wildlife Management Area. And picture A and B are taken from the exact same spot, just 8 years different. So the picture on the left was taken in 2008, and the picture on the right, B, was taken in 2016. And the thing that was done to these sites was, one, they went in and they reduced some of the overstory canopy to allow more sunlight down to the forest floor. And then they added in fire back into the system, and they burned the site 3 times. And you can see kind of from the description on the bottom there. And you can see the difference in the plant community, the difference in the understory, the difference in kind of what those forests look like. And they were able to, on the picture on the left, I think they counted in the neighborhood of 20 to 30 different species of understory plants. And then the picture on the right, they counted over 300 species of understory plants. And so a huge increase in plant diversity, but also wildlife diversity as well. And that was a result of more sunlight to the ground level and adding in fire to help recruit some of these species, like this species here, which is rattlesnake master, and this species that this monarch butterfly is on is blazing star. And none of these species were planted after the fire or planted after any canopy thinning. All of these seeds came back that were just sitting in the soil and ready to go after and were there ready to go just from the natural seed bank. To kind of show you an Indiana example, this is a picture from Willow Slough Fish and Wildlife Area up near Morocco, Indiana. And this is one of our native and natural oak savannas. And so this is pretty sandy soil. The overstory trees are white oaks and sometimes shingle oaks. And then they're pretty wide spaced in that there's not as many trees growing on the site as like a forest, but they're still large mature trees. And then in the understory, there's lots of green growing vegetation. And this is an area that they have been regularly burning in order to kind of enhance this understory. And this is what this site looks like from the top down. And so this is the picture of the understory. So you have really cool species like goat rue, blazing star, little blue stem, Cytotes grama, roundhead lesbideza, all these cool native plants that just came back from the seed bank. And it kind of goes to show you that this site was historically burned, and these plant species came back after the fire, and kind of shows you what fire can do to kind of shape the landscape. This is kind of a more typical picture on the left of what we have a lot in Indiana, and we have these kind of closed canopy forests where lots of trees in the overstory, not much sunlight reaching the forest floor, and not much vegetation growing on the ground level. Versus what we have a picture here on the right, which is more of what we would call an oak woodland, where you have this kind of dappled sunlight coming down, reaching the forest floor, which results in this kind of vigorous growth of this understory vegetation. And then when you add in fire to that system, you get kind of a difference in the plant community. And this picture is, they're not from the same exact location, but they're probably taken less than 50 yards apart. And this picture was taken in 2016, and this picture was taken in 2023. And so in that time frame, they've went through and they've removed some of these smaller trees and added in fire back into the system. And what you get is you get an understory that kind of looks like this. And this is a picture taken of the ground in July after a March prescribed fire. And so not a lot of litter on the ground. All that litter has been consumed and those nutrients have been added back into the soil. And what you get is this kind of prolific sprouting of white oaks and different oak species. So there's white oak there. I think there's some red oak in there somewhere maybe. Greenbrier comes back. You get things like Virginia creeper right here. All kinds of different desmodium species and others come back after this fire. And so we're using fire as a way to kind of shape the plant community and add diversity into the plant community and structure. So we can also use fire as a way to enhance wildlife habitat. And we can do that by kind of creating changes in vegetation composition. We can improve the food quality and quantity, both forage, but also seeds and fruits, and invertebrates. So the ability of birds and other wildlife species to be able to find and eat insects. And most of the benefits that we have for wildlife from fire is through the habitat that's created. Kind of show you this as an example in a grassland. Here is a picture of an unburned prairie, and you can see my Purdue hat in there. That's pretty thick and dense, and it'd be really hard for, let's say, a northern bobwhite quail chick to walk through that. You know, these chicks are the size of bumblebees when they're born. It's really hard for them to navigate through that in order to find the seeds and insects they need. This is a site that was burned in September, and this picture was taken in June. And you can kind of see how open that understory is and how easy it would be for a chick to be able to navigate through there and pick insects and seeds up off the ground. And to kind of show you what this looks like in real time, this is a video that I took of actually a wood duck brood or wood duck chicks walking through a recently burned prairie. And you can kind of see all the chicks that are walking through there. You can kind of see them. There's some right there. And this kind of gives you a example of how easy it is for those young wildlife to move through that cover, but also still have the overhead cover that's providing them escape from things like hawks and other predators. So fire can kind of help make it easier to not only navigate these stands, but also to pick insects and seeds up off there. So another way we can kind of use fire to enhance habitat for wildlife, especially in forested environments, is to kind of add fire and this idea of reducing the canopy together. And when I say canopy reduction, I don't mean completely removing the forest canopy, but just reducing it a little bit so that you have these gaps in the canopy and you allow sunlight to come down from the canopy down in the understory to kind of create vegetation at the ground level. This can increase the sunlight, it can increase cover, both forage and mass production, but long-term it kind of maintains this canopy openness, kind of creates these standing dead trees that we call snags, which are really important to things like bats and woodpeckers. It can kind of add diversity to the landscape for wildlife species. So here's a couple examples of what that might look like. This is a site where we've both burned and reduced the canopy through things like girdling that creates these dead standing trees. And if you're interested in deer and you like to deer hunt, we actually went out and measured the amount of deer food that's out here. And there's about 1,200 pounds of deer forage or food per acre in this stand. If you compare that to a kind of closed canopy mature forest, there's only about 50 pounds of deer forage per acre. So we, over 10 times increase the amount of deer forage in this stand. Another example of this would be this is Niche's Land Trust site near Williamsport, Indiana, called Williams Woods. And they've actually went through here and harvested some of the timber from this site and added in fire back in this stand as a way to promote oak woodlands and promote the wildlife species that thrive in oak woodlands. And the day we were at walking in the stand, I probably saw 20 individuals of this bird species here, which is called a red-headed woodpecker, which really thrive in these kind of open canopy woodlands. And these open canopy woodlands are actually really good for bat species too, things like this Indiana bat. This is another site in southern Indiana where we've done this kind of girdling to remove a few canopy trees to allow more sunlight down to the ground level. And the day we walked through this stand, I happened to look down and there was a little fawn using this area as protection from predators and protection from the weather. So lots of benefits from adding fire and maybe some canopy reduction together in some of our forested systems. So now we've talked about the benefits. I also wanted to talk about the things we need to consider when we're applying prescribed fire on the landscape. Things like wildlife, timber quality and value, smoke, air quality and carbon, water quality, and then things like public perception and public and private safety. And so we talked about the benefits of fire to many wildlife species in that it creates the habitat that they need, but not all wildlife species are going to necessarily benefit from fire. And so there's some trade-offs we need to think about, and think about things like woodland salamanders, ovenbirds, and then spiders are all species that have been shown to not really benefit from fire. And so we can think about that and think about, if we know those species don't benefit, but others do, then we need to think about maybe there's a middle ground to where we can burn some areas and leave some areas unburned so that we can kind of benefit all the species. And then fire can have direct effects on wildlife through things like mortality or injury, displacement, meaning they have to go somewhere else after the fire, and then things like nest disturbance. And so this picture up here is a box turtle that was in a fire. And then that's the picture of what it looked like after the fire. That box turtle survived. It was not injured from the fire, but you can have mortality and injury from fire, especially for slow moving species like reptiles. The picture down there on the right is actually an eastern fence lizard that we saw running out of a burned area into an unburned area. And so I think the kind of takeaway from the wildlife side is that you don't want to burn the whole landscape and you don't want to burn all your property, but you want to have a mixture of burned areas and unburned areas, whether that's in the same year or across years, so that A, you're not burning all the individuals, and B, those individuals can leave the burned area and go to an unburned area. And luckily, we can kind of mitigate most of these direct effects just by changing how and when we burn, by changing the different seasons. So if we're concerned about box turtles, then maybe we do most all of our burning in February and March, when those species are buried in the soil and are not going to be affected by fire. One common question I get is about fire and ticks, and can fire be used to reduce tick abundance? It's a complicated question because ticks have a complicated life history, but there are several studies that indicate that fire can be used to reduce tick abundance and the prevalence of tick-borne illnesses like different things like, and I'm forgetting the name, but anyway, can reduce things like Lyme disease and other tick-borne illnesses. And that's because fire kills ticks and it degrades tick habitat. However, ticks can recover their abundance 1 to 3 years after the fire. And so if fire is being used to control tick populations, it kind of has to be pretty frequently, and it's not going to be a silver bullet. If we just burn our site one time and then don't go back and burn it again, it's probably not going to reduce the tick population long term. It's kind of going to be repeated. Another common question and consideration I get is, what about overstory trees and damage to them, both from timber value and volume loss standpoint? And so fire can damage overstory trees. There's a few examples of what we would call fire scars and scorch marks on trees. But many species that we might be interested in, things like oaks, have thick bark that kind of help reduce these damages. And there's been some studies in Indiana and other states that looked at how much timber value and volume is actually lost with fire. And they found that it's really pretty minimal. Less than 5% of the timber value and volume is lost in a stand when fire is kept pretty low intensity, meaning that it's kind of got short flame lengths and is moving pretty slowly. Another concern that I hear often is related to smoke, air, carbon, and water quality. And these are valid concerns because when you burn, you're creating smoke, and that smoke has to go somewhere. And if we're being conscious about our carbon emissions, we need to think about what effect fire has on carbon and carbon dynamics. And so related to smoke and air quality, there is a Indiana Department of Environmental Management permitting process related to fire and how you burn and when you burn to kind of reduce the impacts of smoke. And we want to think consciously about sending the smoke away from roads and away from smoke sensitive areas like schools, nursing homes, confined feeding operations, and other areas like that. The question of what effect does fire have on carbon dynamics is again, a complicated one, just because carbon dynamics are complicated. But in general, low intensity fires like we would use here in Indiana really are only going to affect our surface carbon, our surface fuel carbon, which is only about 13% of our total forest carbon. Prescribed fire emits much less carbon than wildfires. And if you think about the long-term carbon storage dynamics, and even short terms, prescribed fire, especially at a small scale like we do it here in Indiana, is going to have minor impacts. So you're going to have kind of a pulse and increase in carbon, and then you actually may have more carbon being added back into the environment because you have more green growing plants that are going to suck that carbon out and use it. Water quality is another topic that we hear a lot about, and what effects does prescribed fire have on water quality. There's been a lot of reviews and look at this, and really low intensity fires in the eastern US probably have minimal adverse effects on soil erosion and surface water because we're not affecting the root systems of those plants. And overall, the impacts of water quality from prescribed fire are often short-lived. They're negligible, but if they are adverse, they're very short-lived, and they in some cases can actually be beneficial to water quality. And that with both air, carbon, and water quality, the thing to think about is this is a burned forest, and you can see all this green growing material. All of these green growing material is going to have root system that's going to be filtering water, going to be absorbing carbon. And so while we may increase a pulse of carbon into the atmosphere as we burn, these plants in here are going to be utilizing that carbon, and they're going to be filtering that water on that site. And there's actually some work down in Arkansas where they're actually using fire as a way to protect the drinking water around one of their large reservoirs in order to enhance the water quality and protect it. What about public perception and safety? There's lots of concerns that the public has about fire, and that could be things like wildlife mortality, escapes, smoke and health, limited recreational access are all things that, among others, that the public has concerns about with prescribed fire, and valid concerns as well. We should think about how we kind of communicate about fire, communicate what the actual concerns and risks and things are. I often also get the question of, is fire safe? Well, nothing is without risk. Driving is not without risk. Other activities are not without risk. So there is risk involved with prescribed fire. I mean, you're lighting fire, and you're trying to control it, so there's always risk. And the potential hazards with fire are the fire escapes and then the smoke that's produced from the fire. But less than 1% of prescribed fires escape, and cause issues. And then those smoke impacts can be mitigated. And we'll talk a little bit about how we can make fire safer. So when we think about conducting a prescribed fire, the things that we need to think about are fire, our safety and planning are paramount. So we need to be safe and we need to have a plan going into it. And there's really no substitution for training experience. Experience can teach you a lot that you can't learn from a webinar, or can't learn from a classroom setting. And you really need a burn plan when you're conducting a prescribed fire. So now I'm going to kind of walk you through the steps that we would use when we're trying to apply prescribed fire in the landscape in a safe and controlled way. And so those things are going to be things like training experience, having a burn plan, having the right personnel and equipment, fire breaks, burning under the right conditions, using the right techniques, and then having the right preparation. So again, training experience. We teach a class here at Purdue. These are all forestry and natural resources undergrads that are taking our prescribed fire class, and we teach them how to be safe and give them live hands-on experience for how to use prescribed fire safely. And if folks are interested in fire and using fire, I'll get to some training opportunities later. We also need to think about having a burn plan. So a burn plan is just a document that tells you everything you need to know about how you're going to implement that burn plan. And it's kind of your a way, again, to plan for what to expect when that fire occurs. It's going to have lots of different things, including things like maps. You also have to have the right tools and equipment and PPE. And so when I'm on burns, because I do this professionally, I'm going to be wearing all this fire retardant material like this Nomex clothings. For most landowners, as long as you have 100% natural materials like cotton and wool, you can stay pretty safe. You want to avoid things like Under Armour and synthetic materials, because if that material catches fire, it's going to melt and cause more issues. So you want to make sure you have the right, personal protective equipment, but also equipment. And there's some just examples of a few different tools we might use for a fire. You also want to make sure you're burning under the right conditions. And so you have to kind of be an amateur meteorologist in order to find the right days and times of year to burn. The things we look for most commonly are relative humidity, temperature, and wind. And this is me using a handheld weather monitor on the burn site to check and make sure that the weather is right to be able to burn that day. And you can look at things like forecasts from the National Weather Service to kind of predict when the right conditions are going to be to burn. We have to use the right techniques. And so most of the fires that we do, we use with what's called a backing fire. And that's essentially where you have the wind pushing from the top down to the bottom, and that fire just kind of backs very slowly into the wind and very, very slowly into the wind. You can contrast that to things like a strip head fire, where we let the wind actually push the fire. And what that does is that allows the fire to get bigger and move faster, but it's a little less controllable. So we tend to always start the fires and use primarily backfires because it's safe and effective and moves very slowly. We also want to prepare areas that are going to stop the fire. So things like our fire breaks. And so in the woods, we can use leaf blowers to basically blow the leaf litter away down to bare mineral soil. And that 4-foot section here is going to stop the fire from proceeding. So here's an example of where we blew all the leaves off a forest road, and that fire is effectively stopped at that road because it has nothing to burn. Here's an example of a green growing strip of vegetation that we use to stop the fire as our fire break, because that fire is not going to want to burn through that green vegetation that has a lot of moisture in it. We also want to think about how we can reduce the hazards on a site. So this is the standing dead tree. if we caught this standing dead tree on fire, it would be sending embers up into the air, 30 or 40 feet, and could start a fire where we didn't want it. And so we use a leaf blower to blow out all the leaf litter around that tree in order to stop the fire from catching it on fire. We also notify the right people when we burn. So we always call the county sheriff dispatch to let them know we're burning, so that if they receive a call from someone driving by, that they don't, call it in and they have to send a bunch of resources out when they're not needed. We also call our local fire department and then call the neighbors of the property to let them know that we're going to be burning that day, so that they see smoke, that it's being done and under a controlled environment. We also have what we call a contingency plan, meaning we have a plan for what happens if things go wrong. So if the fire would start to get out across this fire break like it is here, we would know what to do if things go wrong. We know, who to call, when to stop, how to put the fire out, all those things, so that we know what to do when things don't go right. So all of these things are going to be covered inside of this burn plan. And that's going to be your guide to how to implement the burn safely. And so I kind of want to wrap up the talk with kind of a little bit of a video that kind of shows you what all this looks like in a really quick video. So here's an example of us burning a Prairie unit, and we have all our equipment. We have all of our personnel here. So this is only about an acre in size, and we have about 6 or 7 people. We start this burn with a backfire. So you can see the wind is blowing this way, and that fire is just moving very, very slowly. And we kind of work very slowly in order to make sure that we have enough burned area to where this fire is not going to jump from here into this unit where we don't want it to burn. Once we have enough kind of black area, that's probably 50 or 60 feet of black, we start with these strip head fires, which are going to burn a little more intensely and help us kind of consume the fuel and kind of get this done a little bit quicker. And you can kind of see how kind of slowly this is a little bit of a backing fire here. And you can kind of see how big the flames are on this head fire here, where the wind is actually pushing the fire. And so we kind of work slowly, work with chunks at a time, and eventually we will get here to the end to where we can kind of just burn the rest of this unit off. And you can kind of see this black soil surface that's going to help with increasing the soil temperature after the burn. So now we're kind of done. We let that fire burn out, and then that unit's been done and it's not at risk of going anywhere else. And we can kind of move on and burn the next area that we want. But another really good example that shows is that we have a burned area, and then we have refuge of unburned areas for wildlife to go to all around it. So we're not burning the whole property at one time. We're burning smaller chunks so that there's a diversity of cover and resources. So kind of wrap up things. If you're interested in more, there's all kinds of training opportunities through what's called the National Wildland Firefighting Coordinating Group, which kind of does the trainings for wildland firefighting. The Indiana DNR has trainings. We offer trainings through Purdue Extension. There's some online courses. And if you're a landowner and you're interested in having a fire on your property but don't want to do it yourself, there's all kinds of financial and technical assistance to help you with the burn. In summary, fire has been a part of our landscape in Indiana for thousands of years. We can use it to restore ecosystems, and it can be done safely, but it does have risks. And I often say that you just need to have a healthy respect for fire, in that you should not be scared of it, but respect it and the power that it has to kind of shape the landscape. So if you're interested in this presentation, you can scan that QR code, and I think it might be in the chat as well. And I know I didn't leave a whole lot of time for questions, but I can stick on and answer questions if needed.
No, we appreciate that, Jared. Yeah, all the info and different things we will share with our post email our post-program emails. So we did have one question. Does does prescribed burns have a beneficial effect or detrimental effect on invasive species in an area?
Yeah, good question. So that it depends on the species, and so we use fire a lot as a way to reduce multiflora rose and bush honeysuckle. And when I say reduce, I say actually reducing the size of the honeysuckle and multiflora rose. So you can take a bush that's 6 feet tall in a woodland and then make it a bush that's like a foot tall. And so we use fire as like a pre-treatment to herbicide application. So we have to use less herbicide and we can get better control. Other species like Japanese stilt grass, which is in a woodland, it can actually be enhanced by fire. So we need to think, strategically about that.
I was wondering if there was an invasive species or if you burn it, it comes back twice as thick.
Yep, that's one of them. But we can use that to our advantage too, because we can burn and then kind of exhaust the seed bank and use herbicide to control it.
Perfect. Again, if there's a few questions, we can have a little time for that. I did put in the chat box the post-program survey. And as we're kind of wrapping up, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. This is just the schedule for our season 5. So what's coming up in January. I did see that some of you guys have already registered for that. Can you see season 5? I'm assuming you guys can see it. So that'll be coming up. We'll have that registration. Just do that once for that. And if not, we'll have some more time for questions. Jared, thanks again for being on the program. That was one of the video. Not only did I think it was cool, I thought it was very satisfying just to see how you guys work stepwise through all that.
Yeah, it's nice with drones. And then we have these like nice square research blocks at one of our properties. And so you get this like nice square outline of what it looks like after.
Very cool. And then I'm going to stop our recording.